Welcome to GardenDC, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. This is episode 95 of the GardenDC podcast. We're joined by returning guest Michael Judd of Ecologia Design, talking about all things related to willows. This versatile plant family has something for everyone, and I'm sure you'll want to be adding a few to your garden after you hear Michael's enthusiasm for them. The plant profile is on primroses, and I share what's going on in the garden as well as some upcoming local garden events. This episode, we're joined by Michael Judd of Ecologia Design. He was a guest previously on the GardenDC podcast on episode 25, talking all about growing pawpaws. Welcome back to the podcast, Michael.
Thanks, Kathy. Glad to be here again.
Glad to have you back. So today we're talking to you all about willows. And before we jump into that, let's talk a tiny bit about what's going on in your garden in this late winter, early spring timing.
It's all willows right now. My annual garden has gradually become my perennial garden as I keep putting in cuttings of willow and elderberry and black currants. My tomatoes and my squashes are all getting sidelined. So this is the critical time for flipping and propagating. Especially the willows and the other characters I just mentioned. So I'm running around and pruning. And while I'm pruning, I'm taking my cuttings and I'm sticking them, literally just sticking them straight into my garden beds with no treatment to keep that cycle going.
And so do you have things leafing out like your blackberries and those sorts of things?
Not yet. Getting ready. I do have some of the catkins, some of the pussy willows, some of the early ones have popped out, and the others are right behind and ready. We're right on that cusp, which these days always has me hustling to work with the plants in this window. Usually each late winter, early spring, there's about 2 weeks where I jump in, where things are still dormant and I can prune them, stick them, or uproot last year's cuttings while they're still dormant, but getting ready to bud out and root. It's a crazy time, but it's wonderful. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we could steal you away for a little bit from that. And I was just going to ask on the cuttings, which we'll go into in a little bit, and putting them into fresh soil, some of the uses for that. But we're talking now, it's early March, and let's talk a little bit about how the weather has impacted things. Are you finding it earlier this year or later?
I can't remember a year ago. I think it's probably all in the same ballpark. Actually, I think last year might have been a little earlier. But it does kind of vary. This window, this 2-week window does kind of move around. Sometimes it can be the end of February, but it's usually certainly by the middle of March. This window for really working, because I have a small nursery, and almost everything I grow outside. I don't have a lot of infrastructure, greenhouses, etc. I really work with what grows well and easy in my gardens or in sort of some of the limited areas and pots that I work with. But really, I grow most things by cuttings in my garden.
Yeah, and easy is going to be the word of this episode, right, Michael? A lot of this is super easy to do with willows.
Yes. I mean, in general, I only work with things that grow easy. My motto is design for neglect, because that's probably what's going to happen in most cases anyway. So the things I work with, I just, I know they grow well, and I know that they take well and are easy and low maintenance and very productive. That's the combo I'm always after.
And we should note for our listeners who might not have heard that earlier episode where you are located in relation to Washington, D.C.
Yeah, we're in Frederick, Maryland. Beautiful small city, about 45 minutes. I guess we would be northwest of Washington, D.C., and 45 minutes from Baltimore. We're kind of in a triangle here. And we're just above the small city of Frederick in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Our property, we steward about 25 acres with a creek in it. We call it Long Creek. And we have about 3 acres of open areas that are pretty much filled now with food forests, gardens, nursery, and of course we grow mushrooms in the woods. And it's quite a spectacular spot. If you haven't come, it's definitely worth the visit. There's a lot to see and learn from our site.
And lots of pawpaws, and that's what we had talked to you before about is your annual pawpaw festival and the pawpaws you propagate as well.
Yes, we have tons of pawpaws, lots of cultivars, and then of course our Pawpaw Fest every September is a big hit, and an opportunity to come see all the other things: the food forest, the willow collection, the growing willow collection, the living willow structures. Our circular straw bale home. It's quite an adventure to come out here.
Yeah, and I would say that's one of the things when visitors come to your property is those living willow structures. So let's jump into talking about those. So those are literally willows that form an outside structure or some type of protection.
Yes, there's many different types of living structures. To the entrance to our food forest, we have an arch, a beautiful tall arch that creates this very magical, portal. When you walk through it, you're in the food forest, and the food forest it's not growing food in the forest. It's growing food like the forest. So it's kind of our diversified orchard, lots of fruits and nuts and useful plants everywhere. And coming through this beautiful willow arch, you really do feel like you're entering another realm. And for that, and for most of my living structures, I use a hybrid called Winter Glory. And it's a beautiful, very fast growing male, which means it has the big, beautiful flowering catkins, which are also extremely important to the bees. I don't think people realize that the willow genus in general is a huge support to the bees. And is the main way that willows are pollinated is by the honeybees. So, that's a real added benefit to the beauty of this. Plus, this Winter Glory is also a really good basketry willow for sort of larger basketry. And you can imagine for basketry, you need willow rods that are flexible. So they also are really good for creating living structures so that they literally can be pulled over and tied together. And that's how we're creating this living willow arch. That living willow arch, I would say, is probably about 12 feet tall, though it could be woven and held down at a lower level. So that's one. Another one is outside of our straw bale home. We have a willow dome, a beautiful willow dome that's 16 foot in diameter, and it has 12 sort of legs to it going all the way around. And that dome's over where we've tied. So in each one of those 12 sort of pillars, we originally planted 3 willow rods. Again, Winter's Glory. And we started them out at 8 feet tall, right? Because we have a lot of deer. So this is key, right? So we literally just stuck these rods in, cuttings, unrooted, boom, stuck them in 1 foot in the ground, and then pulled them over and tied them, the tall, long middle ones. And then we brought the 2 side ones over as arches. And it created this beautiful dome, which very quickly fills in, which the deer actually very, very conveniently trim up for us so that it actually has this nice little sort of cap to it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about is deer do like eating the willow leaves, but they'll leave the stems alone.
Well, yes and no. So it is a fodder, and traditionally, in many, many parts of the world, in Europe, Australia, other places that the willow is really used a lot, it is a fodder for livestock and animals. So it's a very important food source, a perennial green, and it has tannins in it. So it also is actually very helpful to the sort of the microbiome of the animals as well. So they often don't eat it in excess, but they do appreciate it having it in their diet. So yes, we work a lot with starting with long willow rods. so that they can only, reach up to approximately 5 feet, and everything above 5 feet grows very happily. Now, the one thing that I've noticed is that in the wintertime, the males do like to rub their horns on those really nice
Mm-hmm.
rods. So sometimes I plant, like I said, I planted three in a hole. That helps a lot, so that they can't actually girdle, all three. They might rub on the sides of each one. But again, you could just easily put some chicken wire or something on them during the winter time to keep that rubbing off, so it's not a problem. So another thing that willows are really traditionally used for is basketry, and again, as fodder. And that usage is by coppicing typically, which means just cutting off of the ground and allowing it to reshoot, much like your ornamental clump grasses. You cut them once a year, they reshoot. Same with your willows. You can cut a willow that if it was left as a tree, it might be 40 feet, but you cut it at the ground every year, and you'll have just 5 or 6 foot shoots, and you have a beautiful bush. Now, if you have deer, you would cut that at about 5 or 6 feet in height, and we call that pollarding. And so I pollard the willows here. I have over 50 different species growing. There are over 400 species of willows. Most of those are temperate,
Mm-hmm.
which is mind blowing because most folks are only familiar with one, typically the weeping willow,
Yep.
sometimes the curly willow.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so many. I've got 50 and counting as far as species here on our property. And the way that I'm able to do that, especially in a limited space, is that I am pollarding them every year or 2 years at 5 or 6 feet. And then what happens is they shoot out from there. They shoot these rods out, and they're just so cool looking. And this looks like this funky hairdo, that shoots off of this pollard stem. And when you're pulsing your willows, whether it's coppicing or pollarding, you are getting some of the brightest colors and some of the most curly, whatever the characteristic of your willow is, you are getting such a fresh flush of that. Same with your catkins and your flowers. So it's really actually a fun way and a beautiful way to work with the willows. So you don't have to have a willow tree at all. You literally can just keep cutting these every year and get huge benefits from it. And of course, the bees and everything else will be happy too.
Well, I have to ask a couple mechanical questions in there. And one is, what are you using to cut and get those fresh cuts of them? And then two, what are you using to bind, like when you were creating
Hmm.
that willow structure? How do you tie them together?
Right. So I'm mostly using loppers. Most of the willows, especially the ones that are shot up, they're only a year or two old, aren't very dense, so they cut very easily. You could also use a hand pruning saw very easily. And if you're coppicing, you're cutting. If it's your first time, cutting it back, cut it all the way down to about 6 inches in the ground, and then what that'll do is it'll shoot out new shoots from the buds that are remaining. And then each year, subsequent year, you cut it back to about 2 inches above where you cut it the year before. Again, just so you have those little opportunities for the new shoots to come out of. And then when I am tying my willows together, I'm using that green stretchy tape like you would use on tomatoes. I'm using that. If I have something that's
Mm-hmm.
really strong, like I'm really like pulling a lot together, I might use sort of more of like a rubber, sort of a thin rubber hose that I might use to like hold something a little bit stronger.
And you were mentioning basketry and the uses of willow for that. So do you do
Mm.
your own basketry? Do you have classes? And is it all just from the willow, or do you use like a wooden base that I see sometimes used for baskets?
Well, this is my hopeful future. It's my vision with a lot of what I'm doing with the willows is to sort of help re-enliven the culture of basketry, using willows. So I'm still in the stage of running around and growing them and sharing the story of the willow and getting people interested and getting them to plant them. And one thing I'm considering is looking for support, writing a grant, finding a foundation, even an individual who wants to sponsor me to focus on this is something I'm going to start looking for and putting out there to begin the process of cutting, drying, stripping, and then, yes, weaving and starting to do classes and teach and share that. I would love to put more of my life, energy, and focus into the willow and the culture of willow. But I've got to sort of I need a head start on that. So
Hmm.
I'll keep going at it on my own. But hopefully I'll find some sponsorship, and it'll fast forward a lot more quickly, because the willow really is one of the most resilient regenerative species that we have to work with. It's being used a lot around the world for many different uses. Some of it even as a biofuel. I know in
Mm-hmm.
Sweden, they grow mass amounts of willow for burning and replacing their oil and coal usage. Denmark as well, because it burns so clean, and then it's carbon neutral. It's sequestering, more carbon than is burned. So a lot of countries that are really sort of, I wouldn't say paying attention, but actually caring, about their carbon emissions, are really starting to work with the willow and the poplar, because it's in the same family. So the tulip poplar and the willows are very closely related, and the poplars also coppice and pollard very readily, and can be used in that regenerative way, or for pulp for the paper industry. It's just a very renewable perennial source for many different uses.
I mean, we haven't even gotten into all the medicinal uses.
Yeah,
So,
that's right.
yeah,
It's just endless.
yeah. So I was gonna say willows. The Latin is salix, the salix family, and that's where we get salicylic acid and all of those uses for that, and that comes from really from the bark portion of the willow.
Yes, yeah, that was the original aspirin, and maybe we'll come back to using that more as a balanced, natural medicinal. So yeah, lots and lots of purposes for it. I mean, and then it's also a great soil stabilizer. It's being used a lot in reclamation and stream banks. I always tell people, if they want to kind of do some guerrilla planting to help their favorite streams and rivers, is to get a bunch of willow cuttings as they're going down in their canoe or wading, to start sticking them into the banks, and literally they will root and start to hold that soil. And it's one of the easiest things that most folks, anyone can do.
Hmm.
I'll throw out a resource for that. Ernst Seeds, they're in Pennsylvania. ERNST Seeds. They have a whole category that are live stakes, and they have some willows, probably just your black willow, but then a bunch
Hmm.
of other types too that you can buy and literally just start staking in, guerrilla planting wherever you'd like.
Yeah, and I'm hearing that willows are also good for cleaning toxins out of the soil, like phytoremediation uses. So that would be a great use, in a riparian buffer, or where you're talking about erosion control or living snow fence as well.
Yeah, on old mining, any area. I mean, there's so many different types of willows. There's a willow almost for every occasion and every site. Some that are really drought tolerant, some that'll go grow in the cold up to the Arctic. Some that are beautiful cascaders that grow out of rocks. So the willow, most people think, oh, willow just moist, and no, there's actually only a handful that like it really wet, and then moist is you typically good, and but then they'll be dry and extreme cold. I mean,
Hmm.
there's really just an endless selection of willows. One of the reasons I'm so excited about them.
Yeah, I think in our area, the mid-Atlantic US, we're very used to seeing the weeping willows, and we know that they are water-loving roots, and that they will, there's the caution everybody has not to plant a weeping willow too close to your house, lest it get into the plumbing lines, because the roots are very greedy for water in that way. So our other caution should probably be what you're doing, which is stabbing the fresh cut willow wands into the soil for them to propagate. Were you to put those into, say, your pea patch or somewhere else in a vegetable garden, then you're going to get willows along with your peas
Yeah.
growing, and maybe that's not the best thing for a vegetable bed.
Yeah, that if I forget about a few plantings in my garden, that's what's going to happen. That's for sure. But coppicing them and pollarding them will keep the root structure small. Because you're not allowing it to become a tree, photosynthesize, and expand those roots. You are maintaining it as a bush, and it'll have bush-sized roots. So again, you can be, creative. Even with what would be a larger willow in a smaller space.
And another use of willow that I've been looking at recently is as a plant root hormone, making your own willow water. And I think that's a lot easier for people to be doing at home than buying that hormone rooting powder, correct?
Um, I'd say yes. I'm not sure the full science backs up how good a rooting hormone it is. It definitely is a rooting hormone. And what I'll do, yes, is I'll take my willow cuttings and I'll stick them in a bucket of water. While I continue to cut more, and often for a day or two, and then within that water, I'll also throw my black currant cuttings and my elderberry cuttings, any other cuttings that I'm working on, figs, and that will help. Help get that hormone into them. So yeah, I think it's a good practice. But every cutting often has a different degree of difficulty and needs. So if you're really wanting to be sure, you might want to back it up.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of scientific trials being done with the use of willow water at this point, but not too much published so far. So let's talk a little bit more about the propagation process. When you're taking those cuttings and stabbing them into the soil, are you making a sharp diagonal cut? Are you making a flat cut? How are you doing it on that?
Uh, my top cut, the top part is diagonal. The bottom, I usually don't pay much mind at all. It doesn't seem to matter, especially with the willow. They're so forgiving, and so usually I'll take about a 10 to 12 inch cutting, or sometimes an 8 foot cutting. I would say 12 inches up, and stick. So if I have a 12 inch cutting, I will put about almost 10 inches of that into the ground, and I will only leave one or two leaf buds above the ground, so that all those other leaf buds will start to root out, and I really only just leave a couple above ground. If I'm sticking like an 8 or 10 foot rod into the ground, I'll stick it 1 foot into the ground as an average. You could stick it further, but I find a minimum of 12 inches going in usually is plenty. And it's amazing that these 10 foot rods will root and grow so readily. And it's almost like instant tree, or instant living structure, which is quite exciting,
Hmm.
because they're so lightweight, they're so easy. You're not transporting, a big old plant. People come to my nursery, and I'll give them 10 foot willow whips, and we'll put them in their car, and we'll just kind of bend them around, and they stick them in there, and they're off with a small forest in their car. And they can go home and plant that as a living fence, privacy
Hmm.
fence, a windbreak. Some of the living structures, you can make these nice little bench alcoves with them. We've also made a living children's fort here. You can do little teepees for the children. There's just tunnels. It's just so much fun. There's just endless creative ideas to work with these.
Yeah, and the flexibility is so much fun that, yeah, as you're saying, you can have a little bit of abuse to them and not
Yeah,
worry too much.
yeah.
So,
With
mhm,
certain species. So there
mhm,
there are certain species. One in particular called fragilis, basically meaning fragile, and it's known for having twigs and leaves that easily break off. That's actually one of the ways it propagates itself. As twigs break off, they fall right in the ground, they regrow. And so you do want to select, and that's why a lot of these weaving willows do bend well and do also lend themselves to living structures. Weeping willows are kind of in the middle. They tend to have semi brittle branches. So yeah, getting to know your willows a little bit can be helpful.
mhm.
Or come to my nursery. We've got, we've sorted a lot of it out.
Hmm. Yeah, I was thinking about, in particular, the pussy willows, which are popular this time of year as you're coming up to Easter for people to buy bunches of those. And
Hmm.
they're usually a little bit more stiff and woody branches to them. So you have the American native one, Salix discolor, and then
Mm.
there's Japanese versions,
Yeah.
and those tend to be the more like highly colored, the pink or the black
Yes.
ones.
Yes.
Yeah, which are
Yes.
so
The
beautiful.
Japanese ones are gorgeous. We have one. It's the very earliest one, Mount Aso.
Mm.
It's a Japanese cultivar, and it goes so early. It was the first thing on our entire landscape before anything else to show life, it flowered. And it has these beautiful sort of, starts out sort of like a dark pink, and then it goes light pink and super fluffy, gorgeous catkins. Yes.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody who's bought the dried branches, say at a florist or somewhere, knows what the flower actually looks like, that it comes out with kind of like gold halo around it and then drops those off.
Yes, yes, it has that kind of like that scale bud on it, and the male and the female flowers kind of come out looking similar in that way. But then the males will put out their anthers, and it's just gorgeous. They really kind of like explode, and you get tons of colors from gold and yellow, different reds, and really it's kind of the males that put on the biggest show when it comes to the willow flowers.
Hmm. And that American one, the Salix discolor, that is the host plant for two of our native butterflies in a region, the mourning cloak and the
Mm.
viceroy. So a really nice side benefit to those.
Yeah, and the birds love willows. They love our willow temple. It's almost a big bird nest. They just love being in there. But the willows in general are big support to the birds and the bees. They're just, yeah, they're a huge ecosystem support.
So this is your super busy time for propagating the willows. And then when you're preparing them for sale, do you just dig them bare root for the person who would take them home, or do you pot them up?
Well, ideally bare root. I do bare root now, as they come out, and I encourage people to always come get my bare roots because they'll get the biggest roots. Sometimes the stuff I can't even stick in a pot, and they can take them away right away, and then I start to pot them up. Like so in about a week or so, I'm going to start potting them all up, and then people can still buy them. They're basically bare root, but they're in a pot. That'll get them home and get them in the ground. Most plants really appreciate being planted in March and April. Yeah, once you get into May and you start planting, you're dealing with heat and stress to the plant. So I try to encourage people and put that education out there that plants really like to be worked with when it's cool and moist, and that's late winter, very early spring. And generally, I don't think people are that aware of that. And part of that's the nursery industry has sort of dictated when plants become available because they're coming out of their greenhouses, and horticulture, generally speaking, in our country is kind of built around the commercial horticultural industry and their needs versus the ideal windows for plants.
Hmm, that's very true. And sometimes you'll see some nice potted up willows, especially like the pussy willow cultivars that we mentioned, like the pinks and the black ones. They're kind of grown almost in a topiary shape, like a little fountain spray. And I assume that they've gone through a little bit of pruning and treatment to get them to look like that.
Those are grafted.
Mm.
So if you're talking about, and I've seen these too in the nurseries where they're, I don't know, 5 feet, and then they have a little small cascading weeping branches. Pendula, Capria pendula is the main one that's
Hmm.
used for that. But they're grafted, so a lot of those little small weeping cascaders would be ones you would use, around a pond or in a rock garden. They wouldn't, they might be 6, 12 inches tall only, and they would cascade over rocks. But then grafted onto, a more upright willow at a height of about 5 or 6 feet, then you get this beautiful little cascade at that height. And I'm starting to do that. I'm now getting into grafting all kinds of different types of willows onto other types of willows. I'm getting a little Dr. Seuss around here, and having fun with trying different combinations. Some that might be small that the deer would eat that I couldn't grow, I'll graft up, and so it might be a bush, but now it's going to be a bush on a 5 or 6 foot stem, which I'll pollard as well. So a lot of fun, a lot of unique looks can come out of this. And I hope in the future to have a lot of unique grafted willow cultivars for people who are interested in that.
Yeah, that's a good point about the grafting, and to know that whatever the hardy stock of willow below that graft point is, that you are going to want to have to prune around that.
Right, you're going to want to prune anything below that. But that's also how you can get a beautiful weeping willow, which typically could be a 40-foot tree. You could graft onto, say, a Salix alba Bretensens. So Bretensens is one of my favorite. It's a select seedling from Germany that is this gorgeous yellow. It has a pyramid shape, but it's only about 15 feet tall. It's one of our favorites here. I do have quite a few growing around, but I'm also grafting onto that because I know that it's only going to have about a 15-foot height. So I can take a larger, even like a larger golden weeping willow, Tristis, a very popular large weeping golden willow, and I can graft that on to my Bretensens, and I'm going to have a 15-foot tall, beautiful golden weeping willow that the deer will probably trim up nicely for me, right to about 5 feet. You know what I'm saying? I mean, just perfect.
Yeah, I just love the look of a huge old weeping willow, like above a pond, kind of slightly uphill. And you could, when you were a kid, you could kind of use it as a fort or a place of refuge or a
Yeah.
place to go and read your books. So it's always a nice, picturesque place to play.
Yeah, they're magical. I love weeping willows. I still just stop and stare at them. They have these if you look at them, they have these very, very long, hair-like branches. Sometimes they're 6 or 7 feet long, and they just sit there and wave and move. And yeah, there's a lot of character in them, a lot of spirit.
Now, for creating a fence line or a hedge with willow, you would probably want to at some point be able to contain it because, the same thing that we would have been doing a few decades ago with bamboo, and then the next homeowner comes in and doesn't realize that they have to keep
Right.
on top of that. So would you plant it with a barrier in the ground around it, or how would you control the willow from spreading?
Well, so there's only actually a few willows that spread, and it is a good point to bring up that there are a few rhizominous, sort of spreading by their root type willows. But generally speaking, most are not going to propagate that way at all. So there's not really a general fear of the willow spreading. But let's say that you did plant a living fence of a willow that might typically get 15 to 20 feet tall. But you were keeping it hedged, you were cutting it every year at 6 feet and you liked that, but then boom, you left and it went a lot higher. I could see that as maybe challenging somebody, but there's quite a few choices. One of my favorite choices is a bush willow, a very ornamental bush willow that only gets 5 or 6 feet tall, period. It's called Gracilius nana. Very beautiful, thin, multi-stemmed shrub that is very beautiful in a planting like that. And in full sun, it's only gonna be about 6 or so feet tall. So again, you can select knowing what your mature height is going to be. Again, design for neglect is wise. So go ahead and plant what you want without having to worry about maintaining it. But if you're kind of in love with another type of willow, you can weave beautiful willow fences and get very quick privacy or windbreak. Someone just emailed me saying they just got a puppy and they wanted to put in the willows so that by the time it was a big dog, the fence would be grown in. So there's endless options.
So, what are some of the varieties or cultivars of willow that you're growing now that
Ah.
you're really in love with?
Oh, I feel like I'm so in love with so many of them. The Bretensens that I mentioned, a really big fan. Some of the curlies, I have one that we grow called Scarlet Curly, and it is gorgeous. Very strong grower, and the branches are super twisty. I mean, like they just twist, 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 and then they'll have reds and oranges in them. Beautiful flowers, just a gorgeous, very strong, vibrant tree. So the Scarlet Curly. There's also a Golden Curly, which is very similar in its growth. That's just a beautiful gold. There's a Sunny Twist that we have that I like a lot. We have a Chocolate Curly. So I'm a fan of a lot of the curlies, and again, those are wonderful for cut and use.
Mm-hmm.
My wife and my little daughter have been walking around behind me and just picking up. And my son today too actually went and made a bouquet, just collecting the odds and ends from all of my prunings, and they're just gorgeous. Let's see, what other favorites do I have? Well, like I say, I use them for lots of different purposes. There's one called Aquatica Gigante, and I think it's another German selection with a large leaf, and it's a really good fodder. So it has a large leaf, good for, because I work a lot with agroforestry systems. I work a lot with nut orchards and really kind of trying to design, long-term perennial food systems, and integrating animals and agroforestry and alley cropping. Willow like that does really well as a fodder and as a windbreak. Let's see what else. Oh, black mall is a triandra, which is a beautiful, fine basketry willow. So we have these very fine, small type willows that are called osiers. You might have heard of osier willow. And England, they have these huge areas of osier growing beds, usually along the rivers,
Mm-hmm.
that they grow and cut, for basketry. And they just have they have everything from very fine rods to more coarse. But a lot of the finer basketry are coming from these more thin rod, very strong type willows. The purpurea is a very large species that has a lot of great selections for basketry in particular, and is one of the less palatable to deer. So really kind of depending on your deer pressure, the purpurea group is one of your safer bets to where they may not nail it as much. Again, everyone's pressure
Mm-hmm.
varies, but that's one of your better bets. And then, of course, the black willow that grows everywhere around here. It's one of the ones I see the deer not eating, and it's actually a really good. I like the way it grows because it grows out as sort of multi-stemmed, often from low in the ground, and they get about I don't know, 6-8 inches in diameter, and that's great for growing mushrooms on. So I grow a lot of oyster and shiitake mushrooms, and the willow wood is really good for growing oyster mushrooms on. So another just another wonderful use
Hmm.
of the willow. Once
And
again,
I wonder if that is because of the salicylic acid and there's some type of
no,
association there.
maybe, but I think it's probably just extra tannic. Maybe it's too
Mm-hmm.
tannic for them. I think tannin in the leaf is one of the
Ah.
aspects, or just extreme bitterness, which I think varies in the different willows. Some are sweeter than others, I guess. But yeah, it's they don't go for the black willow, whereas they've just about eaten every other willow I've grown.
So on the curly willows, especially love the sound of that chocolate willow because who doesn't like chocolate? But the curly ones, do you have any advice for getting it to be more curly? Is it the newer growth that forms as curls
Yes.
or the older?
Yes, so it's newer growth. So when you're cutting it, yearly or biannually, or sometimes people might do it every 3 years, kind of depending on the growth habit of the willow. You get the most vibrant colors. You get the most curl from the curly willows. You really get like a lot of the stuff that you're finding or buying in the floral industry are coming from these coppiced type willows. Because if you let them go, and I've actually been thinking about this because some of these super curly ones that I have, I'm wondering how they would look if I let them go. I don't know if they would just tangle themselves up. I don't know. They're
Hmm.
so curly. Some of them are. So there's a variation. Like Sunny Twist is only moderately curly, and I could see that kind of growing up fine as a tree. But Scarlet Curly and Golden Curls, I mean, they twist so much into themselves that it would be like a one super crazy hairdo if it got really big. But I don't know because I'm always pollarding and cutting mine
Mm-hmm.
again because I want those colorful shoots, but then also I'm growing a lot of willows in a small space. So by doing that, I can put them 8, 10 feet apart. I can grow a lot of willows in a small area just by cutting them every season.
And one additional species of willow that I was going to ask if you're growing are the dappled or variegated kind with the foliage that
Ooh,
comes like in white
yeah,
tips. And
yes,
there's one I love
yeah.
called flamingo because it's just that right tone of pinky orange that's a flamingo coat.
Yeah, so the most popular one out there is, let me see if I can get this right, is Hakiro Nishiki. It has those pinks and whites to it. And those you definitely want to keep cutting because they need stimulation. They struggle to get, photosynthesis and chlorophyll. Because they don't have that green element in them. So by cutting them and stimulating that new growth is one of the ways to keep them sort of vibrant and healthy. So yeah, but the Haikiro Nishiki, and then the flamenco is probably a variation, or it could even be the same. Could be a nursery name for that. Sometimes they'll name
Yeah.
something popular. But
Yeah.
yes, I love that one. It's much more of a shrub. I am getting it to grow as a small tree, but it's another one that I'm going to start grafting. I'm going to start grafting that onto some more of my uprights, so that I can get it up out of the deer's reach, and not necessarily grow it as a shrub, which is its tendency.
Yeah, that's how I see it in the landscape use is similar to a forsythia shrub in size and shape,
Mm-hmm.
that people would prune it that way for that foliage color.
It is gorgeous. It is really worth it. I highly recommend it.
So how can our listeners get in contact with you?
Check out our website, ecologiadesign.com. It's really quite an amazing site with everything from pawpaws to how to shape your landscape to harvest water, to willows, to food forests, to mushrooms, all the things that I'm involved in. We do have intermittent workshops on site where you can come and really see everything and then focus on real hands-ons learning. And then of course our Pawpaw Fest, another great time to come and visit us. I have a couple of books. My first book, Edible Landscaping with a Permaculture Twist, is a really how-to and how to set up your landscape, designed for neglect. And then For the Love of Pawpaws, my second book, is focused on pawpaws, but also really again brings in aspects of how to really, really work with your landscape and grow, any kind of fruit and nuts, and really establish your site so that whatever you plant grows really well. So yeah, those are all resources. There's YouTube channel, Edible Landscaping with a Permaculture Twist. Instagram at Permaculture Ninja, Facebook. I'm not hyper focused on a lot of them these days, but there's a lot out there that I've done that you can look at.
Great. Well, thank you, Michael, for sharing a little bit of your willow obsession with us. And any final thoughts for listeners on growing willows?
Yeah, another great resource for getting cuttings is Vermont Willow. Vermont Willow is also a great website to surf through. One of my inspirations and mentors in Willow is Michael Dodge, who just retired and handed over Vermont Willow, but still is overseeing and very involved. But really, it's his collection. And you can get cuttings from him. I don't do too many cuttings. I do the long rods for people to come and get. And I might in the future do more cutting wise, but you can get quite a collection from him. And he breaks it up into groups, for bees, for ornamentals, for basketry. So his website is a willow universe. It's a wonderful willow world to surf around in. So I would shout out for Vermont Willows.
Well, thanks for sharing that resource, and I love calling it a wonderful willow world.
Yes,
Right.
it is.
So happy spring, Michael, and thank you again.
Thanks, Kathy.
Primrose plant profile. Primroses, Primula hybrids, are a cold hardy perennial to USDA zones 4 through 8. They come in an array of flower colors, including reds, whites, yellows, oranges, purples, or pinks, with yellow centers and scalloped green foliage. They are widely sold as a houseplant at local supermarkets and garden centers in late winter and early spring. At just $2 to $5 each, I buy several and use them to decorate my home with flowers during the gray days of January and February. When they stop flowering, I plant them out in the garden in a moist, part-shade spot. They come back reliably each year with little to no care and bloom about the same time outdoors as they did inside. One extra step I do for them is that I pinch out any spent blossoms as I come across them during regular watering. Side note, never let them dry out. This encourages more and longer flowering from the plants. You can also give them a few drops of liquid fertilizer to prompt more flower formation when they start to slow down. Rather than compost these sweet little plants, why not plant them out in your garden and be rewarded with blooms for years to come? Primrose, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, imagine my surprise after last week's episode all about magnolias to go out in the garden and see my Jane Little Girl Series magnolia had already opened up and is blooming its head off. A couple weeks early, but still welcome. Also welcome, but a bit early in the garden, are the Mount Hood trumpet daffodils. And they are joined by the tete-a-tete daffodils, jetfire daffodils, and the February gold still hanging on, as well as many different kinds of crocus, snowdrops, and hellebores. In the local gardening world, there's some upcoming plant sales that you'll want to mark your calendar for. One is the Beloved Gardens Vegetable, Herb, and Perennial Plant Sale. This is at a church in Frederick, Maryland on Saturday, April 30th. From 9 a.m. to 2 p.m., rain or shine. It's at 4880 Elmer Durr Road. And then there's the Bethesda Community Garden Club's annual plant sale returning on Thursday, May 12th from 9 a.m. to noon. It's held outdoors at the Bethesda Farm Women's Market and is open to the public. Next, on Saturday, May 14th, the Montgomery County Master Gardener Spring Event Grow It, Eat It is happening, and that's from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. with a rain date of Sunday, May 15th. That's at the Agricultural History Farm Park in Durwood, Maryland. Entry to the event is free, but some of the programs on that day are advanced reservation and by fee. There's also a small group of vendors, crafts, and plant clinics along with that. Happy gardening!
In the new book, The Urban Garden by Kathy Jensen, Teri Speight, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space, while also making a lush outdoor living area you'll crave spending time in. The Urban Garden, 101 Ways to Grow Food and Beauty in the City, comes out this spring. You can pre-order it now at Amazon.com and bookshop.org.
Celebrate spring with 4 exciting gardening books and their authors. This free online party takes place on Thursday, March 24th at 7 p.m. Eastern. It is sponsored by National Garden Bureau and Garden Communicators. During this live webinar, you'll get to virtually meet the 4 authors and learn some of their best gardening tips. Those authors are Sean and Allison McManus, Christy Wilhelmi, Raphael DeLallo, and Tony Gattoni. Attendees will also have a chance to win one of 3 gardening giveaways. Register for this free webinar at ngb.org, select the Education tab, and scroll down to Webinars. See you there.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to anchor.fm/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to washingtongardener.com. Thank you. You can find Washington Gardener online at washingtongardener.com, on Twitter at WDC Gardener, on Instagram at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook.com at Washington Gardener Magazine.